Welcome back to College Unbound, the free online learning program from the MRC. In this series, we've explored the people and ideas behind Marxism collectivism. And now, in part 10, we don our armor to delve into the inevitable, deadly consequences of collectivism in practice. Hi everyone, I'm Gardner Goldsmith. Thank you for joining us and spreading the word. I think one needs to lay down intellectual stepping stones as we explore the hellish landscape created by people who embraced and espoused Marxism and collectivism. The first stone is that this is a brief but frightening and brutal tour. As such, one must bear in mind that each of these real dystopian lands could be the subject of an investigation of its own. And then each of those could be turned into thousands, hundreds of thousands, or tens of millions of personal memories about the tortured and crushed and raped and robbed and murdered and threatened innocents who became targets of the collectivists. We should firmly grip the awareness that all of these digits, these statistics, represent people, young and old, whose fates and hopes were crushed by collectivism. And we best begin this dark voyage into reality by acknowledging the fact that long before the fecal appellations of fake news were thrown around by contemporary pop news propagandists who seem to attack anyone with an individualist will, the battle for truth about collectivist nations raged. And that compels one to acknowledge and praise the courageous Western journalists and professors who told the truth about many of the nightmare nations. Foremost among them is 20th century British American writer and poet Robert Conquest. Ridiculed and reviled by tiny-minded media apologists for collectivism, Conquest stood tall and ceaselessly reported the truth. As the Jacobin clone jackals bit at his heels, he remained steadfast, pointing a rigidly accusatory finger at the collectivist criminals, their horrific crimes, and those apologists who constantly hid the truth or claimed his investigatory revelations weren't true. They were true. And it's time for us to see some of what he chronicled. For each of these countries, for explorations long and short, we'll split the troubles into A, terror and tyranny, and B, economic deprivation, depression, hardship, famine, starvation, and death. But as we learned earlier in our series, we have to remember that the political tyrannical actions are interwoven with the negative economic effects, and that in the West, people suffer from softer forms of political collectivism that retard and harm their lives, living standards, and liberty, even as Americans suffer under the delusion that they live in what still could be called the land of the free. Now, with that as context, we dive into world history, starting with the biggie, the Soviet Union. For decades, as Conquest tried to sound the alarm about the atrocities that generations of communist Soviet rulers were committing, leftist intellectuals and media elites, such as the progressives' darling, American so-called journalist later revealed to have been a Soviet-paid propagandist spy, I.F. Stone, denied that reality, telling Americans that such claims were the lies of conservative fascists, while never acknowledging that their own beloved left collectivism was the sibling of fascism, both of which were scions of Marxist ideology. After the 1989-1991 collapse of the USSR, when writers such as Conquest were proven right, when Stone was revealed to be a Soviet liar, and when the brutal despotism of Soviet Marxism became undeniable, one of the new great canards promulgated by Western leftists was that, well, sure, the USSR was a tyrannical hellhole and economic basket case, but that wasn't real communism or real socialism. For wider reference, take a look at the excellent two-part video productions John Stossel has done on the topic, and as a way to whet your appetite for the great truths therein, we refer you to Stossel's guest, economist, author, and economics professor at Texas Tech's Rawls College of Business, Benjamin Powell. When confronted by claims from leftist professor and author Noam Chomsky that the USSR was
about as remote from socialism as you can imagine,
Powell laid out the clear and devastating truth. observing,
"It's absurd to say that the Soviet Union was remote from socialism."
When the Bolsheviks under Lenin made private commercial exchange illegal, notes Powell,
"That's about as close as the world ever saw to the pure socialist end of the spectrum."
which is absolutely right. In fact, we sat down with Powell to expand on his world-ranging observations, many of which are spelled out in his book, Socialism Sucks, co-written with Professor Robert Lawson of Southern Methodist University. And we'll have more from Professor Powell in this lesson. Right now, let's explore the terror and tyranny employed when, in 1917, devoted Marxists, with the financial backing of leftist collectivists from the West, wiped out the provisional government that had replaced Russian Tsarist control. On the very day that Lenin, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Joseph Stalin, Leon Trotsky, Lev Davidovich Bronstein, and their mob of Marxist Bolsheviks took power in Moscow, that being October 25th, 1917, party bloc thugs also seized the printing press facilities of Russkaya Voya, and many other followed, along with the October 28th Council of People's Commissars edict banning so-called bourgeoisie publications, which read in part, quote, "Everyone knows that the bourgeois press is one of the most powerful weapons of the bourgeoisie, especially at the crucial moment when the new power, the power of workers and peasants, is only affirming itself. It was impossible to leave this weapon in the hands of the enemy, for in such moments it is no less dangerous than bombs and machine guns." Destroying free speech for emergency purposes, demonizing political enemies. Does that sound reminiscent of what many contemporary U.S. political leftists have said about free speech online? Sure does. And the Marxists also said, quote, "As soon as the new order becomes consolidated, all administrative pressure on the press will be terminated, and it will be granted complete freedom within the bounds of legal responsibility, in keeping with a law that will be broadest and most progressive in this respect." And isn't that quaint? Indeed, a word salad claiming that the armed closure of newspapers is, quote, "administrative pressure," end quote. That, quote, "freedom," end quote, is something that the government grants. And to top that off, to apply the typically exposing caveat of, quote, "within the bounds of legal responsibility," end quote. Said legality dictated, of course, by the state. Is it any wonder that freedom of speech never returned to the USSR until the hammer and sickle flag fell on December 25th, 1991? Then there was the almost instantaneous Soviet collectivist seizure of firearms, recounted by Nikolai Shevchenko and printed in 2017 by Russia Beyond the Headlines. Quote, "In 1918, the Bolsheviks initiated a large-scale confiscation of civilian firearms, outlawing their possession and threatening up to 10 years in prison for concealing a gun." And he added, "The only exception was made for hunters, who were allowed to possess smoothbore weapons. Gun licenses, however, were strictly regulated and only issued by the NKVD, the police organization known for its role in Joseph Stalin's political purges." Ah yes, the NKVD, offspring of Lenin's original terror force, the Cheka, aka All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. The secret police, tasked with, quote, "protecting the people's revolution," end quote, given unlimited power to wipe out those innocents termed domestic anti-government terrorists. Does that kind of rhetoric sound vaguely familiar, Americans?
So I know, looking forward, that the members of the Biden team who have been nominated or have been appointed are now moving in laser-like fashion to try to uncover as much as they can about what looks very similar to insurgency movements that we've seen overseas, where they germinate in different parts of a country and they gain strength, and it brings together an unholy alliance frequently of religious extremists, authoritarians, fascists, bigots, racists, nativists, even libertarians.
Well, in Russia, post-October 1917, Lenin used that rhetoric a lot. Indeed, despite the years and thousands of leftist U.S. propagandists who've lied, claiming the USSR murder state was not a logical outgrowth of Marxism, and despite all those Western leftists who've lied, claiming that the decades of terror and death weren't started with Lenin, he was, in fact, the man behind it. Formed by Lenin's own decree in December 1917, the Cheka, popularly known as the sword and shield of the revolution, was granted the power to arrest and kill on sight, arbitrarily. It grew from approximately 200 to over 100,000 members in just 3 years, all to, quote, protect the state, end quote, which the rulers of the state platitudinously claimed and still claim in virtually every nation where the claim is also and always false. They represented the people, or the workers.
Dzerzhinsky said that the disarming of the anarchists dispersed the illusion widespread abroad that Soviet power was on the verge of its downfall.
Under its first iron-fisted, bloodthirsty, sinister leader, Felix Dzerzhinsky, the Cheka became the model for the Nazi Gestapo, Germany's collectivist, National Socialist secret police, which of course was tasked with providing, quote, homeland security, end quote. Perhaps this too sounds familiar to Americans. Writing for the Mises Institute, historian Anthony Samaroff notes, quote, Lenin did not have to satisfy himself with assassinating the character of those who opposed him. As dictator, he could wipe his opponents out, literally. Workers demonstrated against Lenin in Petrograd, and their leaders were shot by the Soviet police. Thousands of sailors who were former supporters of Lenin were massacred by the Red Army for revolting in Kronstadt. Estimates of how many were killed by the Bolsheviks after the beginning of the Russian Civil War in 1918 range from 10,000 to over 10 times that number. Lenin's army used chemical weapons on farmers who resisted the confiscation of the grain they had grown in the Tambov region of 1920 to 1921, where around 100,000 peasants were arrested and 15,000 were shot dead. And these are just a fraction of the innocent souls who would perish in Lenin's Red Terror, a 5-year campaign of terror. 5 years of terror, arrest, firing squads, imprisonment in work camps, destruction of homes, farms, and businesses, and outright mass murder. It was created and instituted and aptly named by Lenin. Begun in September of 1918 and running through much of 1922, the Red Terror was carried out under the command of Felix Dzerzhinsky, his Cheka, and units of the Red Army. For, as Dzerzhinsky said at the time, quote, our revolution is in serious danger. We tolerate too good-naturedly what is transpiring around us. The forces of our enemies are organizing. The counter-revolutionaries are at work and are organizing their groups in various sections of the country. The enemy is encamped in Petrograd at our very hearth. We have indisputable evidence of this, and we must send to this front the most stern, energetic, hardy, and loyal comrades who are ready to do all to defend the attainments of our revolution. Do not think that I am on the lookout for forms of revolutionary justice. We have no need for justice now. Now we have need for a battle to the death. I propose, I demand, the initiation of the revolutionary sword, which will put an end to all counter-revolutionists. This murder as justice mentality started prior to the revolution in July 1917 with the assassination of then imprisoned Tsar Nicholas II and his Romanov family on orders by Lenin. And it ran straight through Soviet history until 1991. In fact, shortly after the, quote, People's Revolution, end quote, in November 1917, Lenin issued a decree dissolving all courts. Why bother with true justice and peace, with voluntary interaction and free will, when Marxist collectivist so-called justice embraces envy, theft, control, aggression, and the purge of any and all nonconformists and undesirables who might stand against the collective? As Aaron Blakemore writes for National Geographic, quote, "We are not waging war against individual persons," said Cheka leader Martin Latsis. "We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class," end quote. He encouraged his fellow Cheka members to lash out at people suspected of being sympathetic to the bourgeoisie instead of looking for evidence that they had actually acted against the Soviets. Within months, the Cheka executed at least 10,000 people. Thousands more were placed in camps that were liquidated in frequent massacres. The death toll of the Red Terror may have been much larger. By some accounts, up to 1.3 million may have been its victims. However, due to secrecy, censorship, and the summary nature of many of the executions, the true extent of the Red Terror will likely never be known. This episode of College Unbound is not a discourse on Lenin alone. But as we heard Benjamin Powell note, and despite Western apologists' decades of denial, this is the true outcome of Marxism collectivism instituted by Lenin and his partners at the time, Trotsky and Stalin. It was Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, driven by Marxism collectivism, who shut down free speech, who confiscated arms, who thought of and started the terror, and it was Trotsky who dreamed up and Lenin who established the vast network of prison and Soviet slave labor camps described from first-hand experience by Russian dissident writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn. And of course, they were called the Gulag. An Anglicanized acronym for Glavno Upravlenie Azbravetel no Trudovik Lagere, the Gulag system grew like fungus across Russia, otherwise known as the newly named Soviet Union, and across the captive nations it attacked and absorbed, even seeing Soviet communists take over monasteries to fill them with prisoners and wring slave labor from them. Literally, Lenin and his line of successors turned monasteries into murderous slave plantations, and it was Lenin's crew that started it. As author Richard Pipes noted in 2014, quote, "The empire of concentration camps, which Solzhenitsyn labeled the Gulag Archipelago, was the work not of Joseph Stalin, to whom it is usually attributed, but of Lenin and Trotsky. The first camps were established as early as 1918 during the Civil War. They were gradually expanded until by the early 1920s, they numbered in the hundreds." And as the U.S. National Park Service observes, beginning from its inception as one political prison, the former Solovetsky Monastery, the Gulag grew to encompass dozens of major camp complexes with thousands of individual camps and millions of inmates. The camp population grew from 179,000 in 1929 to 2,468,524 in 1953, reaching its height in 1950 with 2,525,146 inmates. Perhaps 18 million persons in total were incarcerated in the Gulag in this period. While numbers are sketchy, of the much larger number of Gulag inmates, plus exiled special settlers and labor colonists, often youth detention facilities, that totaled 26 million in these years, perhaps 1.5 million perished. And not only were there at least that many who were killed by Soviet collectivism in the Gulag, there were countless more innocent, God-given lives extinguished by the forced marches and migrations of prisoners headed to the Gulag. One of the most important and educational texts about this horrific experience can be found in this book, The Long Walk, by Slavomir Rawitz, who was taken from Soviet-occupied Poland and sent to Gulag in Siberia. Then, teaming up with two other prisoners in 1941, he escaped and literally walked 4,000 miles across Siberia, through China, the Gobi Desert, Tibet, and over the Himalayan mountains to be free and reach India. In the opening section of the book, Rawitz recounts many of the horrific crimes he and others suffered on the journey to the camp. And I'd like to offer part of his account of it. Traveling over 1,000 miles in one of many rail boxcars packed with other helpless, innocent men who had been captured and deemed disposable or non-essential by collectivist ideology. This coming before he and the survivors of the rail trek were forced to march another 1,000 miles for over a month into winter-frozen Siberia. of the rail torment, on page 30, Rawitz writes this: "Towards the end of the first week, our 60 men had organized itself with rough community rules. A rota system was started to enable everyone in turn to enjoy the close-packed body warmth of the middle of the truck, aka the train car. Everyone in turn experienced the numbing cold of the truck walls. It was getting colder and colder, and those perimeter positions were grim." Later, Rawitz recounts this: "There were men like me who were determined not to die. There were the others in whom the spark of hope had already been crushed when they were first herded into these traveling coffins. They died without a whisper in the long nights when their turn came to stand out of the warmth of the ruck. They died standing, and we did not know they were dead until the door opened in the light of morning." Once locked into the Gulag, the inmates were called zeks, often forced to build their own wooden sleeping shacks and forced to labor for the collective. The U.S. Park Service offers a strong overview of the expansive evil. Quote, "Some of the, quote, crimes, end quote, that landed one in the Gulag included unexcused absences from work, petty theft, conveying an anti-government joke, or being a prisoner of war. Gulag prisoners, when released, were often restricted to residency in the zone, the camp complex, and were forced to continue working as, quote, free laborers, end quote, on much of the same work they did as prisoners. The Gulag evolved into an economic empire as much as a network of forced labor prisons. At its height, 1 in every 50 Soviet workers was a zek."
For those imprisoned in the gulags, no place was worse than the remote penal colonies of Kolyma. With frigid, sub-zero temperatures, the Kolyma gulags are in reality glacial graveyards. But Kolyma is also the site of Russia's richest gold deposits. So not only were the Soviets able to punish people here, they reaped enormous riches from the forced labor.
Recall Plank 8 of Marx's Communist Manifesto. Equal liability of all to labor. Establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. And in fact, this is the direct application of it. In the US, the force is applied through the extortion of taxes, fascistic regulatory edicts, and threats of imprisonment for those who don't comply, while in the USSR, the government went for direct enslavement. Here's more from the Park Service. Quote, "Zeks were used as nearly dehumanized slave labor and toiled on such large-scale projects as canal and railroad construction, gold mining, logging, the Soviet atomic project, and myriad other tasks. The great camp complexes of Karaganda, Kolyma, and Norilsk acted as mechanisms of forced colonization to open the Soviet Union's frozen north and empty steppes. The forced labor of elite scientists in the so-called sharashkas, or prison laboratories, produced technological innovations, especially weaponry. Sergei Korolev, the father of the Soviet space program, was probably the most famous of the sharashka scientists. And while the Soviet government created terror ramped up and freedom declined, the economic consequences of the tyranny and bureaucratic central planning began to grow. As George Mason University professor of economics and philosophy Peter Betke writes in his great book, The Four Pillars of Economic Understanding, by the time Lenin, Trotsky, and their Marxist Central Committee ally and Pravda writer Nikolai Bukharin thought to adjust their terroristic central plans, it was too late to save the economy. Butkin notes on page 75 that Bukharin authored what was called the New Economic Policy between 1921 and 1928, or NEP, a series of proposed drawbacks of state planning and controls, and the real allowance of a small amount of property ownership and market exchange. Quote, as Bukharin, wrote in 1924, the adoption of NEP was a collapse of our illusions. We thought then that our peacetime policy would be a continuation of the centralized planning system of that period. And Betke goes on to observe, and perhaps His most famous essay of this period, Concerning the New Economic Policy and Our Tasks, written in 1925, besides encouraging the peasants to, quote, enrich themselves, end quote, Bukharin explicitly acknowledged Ludwig von Mises's free market criticism of socialist planning and argued that Mises was, quote, one of the most learned critics of communism, end quote. Bukharin went so far as to admit that Mises's criticism of communism was correct, at least for the historical epoch in which he wrote. But it was not to be. Lenin, Trotsky, and Bukharin would soon be dead, and Stalin would control the bureaucratic collectivist state they had imposed.
Lenin's behest has been carried out in life by the great Stalinist program of construction.
The results were even more nightmarish than what already had been visited upon the people of Russia and its growing circle of prisoner satellite states. They included the state-created famine in Ukraine and the extermination of those called kulaks. As the History Place explains, after Lenin's weak attempts to allow for Ukrainians to recoup some of their stolen culture and economic liberty, quote, when Lenin died in 1924, he was succeeded by Joseph Stalin, one of the most ruthless humans ever to hold power. To Stalin, the burgeoning national revival movement and continuing loss of Soviet influence in the Ukraine was completely unacceptable. To crush the people's free spirit, he began to employ the same methods he had successfully used within the Soviet Union. Thus, beginning in 1929, over 5,000 Ukrainian scholars, scientists, cultural and religious leaders were arrested after being falsely accused of plotting an armed revolt. Those arrested were either shot without a trial or deported to prison camps in remote areas of Russia. And as the pathological Uncle Joe filled more gulags with more prisoners, quote, Stalin also imposed the Soviet system of land management known as collectivization. This resulted in the seizure of all privately owned farmlands and livestock in a country where 80% of the people were traditional village farmers. Among those farmers were a class of people called kulaks by the communists. They were formerly wealthy farmers who had owned 24 or more acres or had employed farm workers. Stalin believed any future insurrection would be led by the kulaks. Thus, he proclaimed a policy aimed at, quote, liquidating the kulaks as a class, end quote. Because, of course, people who have more obviously are exploiters, capitalists, and enemies of the envious, those who adore Marxism. Quote, declared enemies of the people, the kulaks were left homeless and without a single possession as everything was taken from them, even their pots and pans. It was also forbidden by law for anyone to aid dispossessed kulak families. Some researchers estimate that 10 million persons were thrown out of their homes, put on railroad boxcars, and deported to, quote, special settlements, end quote, in the wilderness of Siberia during this era, with up to a third of them perishing amid the frigid living conditions. Men and older boys, along with childless women and unmarried girls, also became slave workers in Soviet-run mines and big industrial projects, end quote. After all, the state will make the right decisions. The state will force people to work, and that'll be great, just as Marx said. Quote, back in the Ukraine, once proud village farmers were by now reduced to the level of rural factory workers on large collective farms. Anyone refusing to participate in the compulsory collectivization system was simply denounced as a kulak and deported.
People were dying in the streets of the cities and cases of cannibalism occurred. Historians till this day argue what Stalin's exact motives were for this man-made famine.
Those are just a few facts about the black history of Soviet Marxism collectivism, as its goals to make everyone somehow economically equal saw the elimination of freedom, the death of subjective valuation, the death of personal market choice, the death of properly functioning division of labor, and the death of peaceful market resource allocation and productivity. And in order to, quote, make people equal, end quote, its state operators created a nightmare world of threats, robbery, arrest, murder, and famine. Because collectivism doesn't allow for proper resource discovery and productivity to increase resource availability, it sees resources as increasingly limited and under political control. And even as the collectivist state collapses, like a drug addict who can't hold his own job, the collectivist state attacks and plunders others in an ever faster unraveling of international peace. Right here, the Black Book of Communism estimates upwards of 20 million people killed by Soviet Marxists. And former University of Hawaii professor R.J. Rummel's analysis places the number much higher. Quote, probably 61,900,000 people, 54,769,000 of them citizens, have been murdered by the Communist Party, the government of the Soviet Union. But that was just the beginning of the 20th century collectivist harvest of death. In China, the communists who had fomented to take control since the 1920s seized power in Beijing under Mao Zedong, starting in 1949. And immediately, the terror, repression, and starvation began.
From 1958 to 1962, his Great Leap Forward policy led to the deaths of up to 45 million people, easily making it the biggest episode of mass murder ever recorded. Mao thought that he could catapult his country past its competitors by herding villagers across the country into giant people's communes. In pursuit of a utopian paradise, everything was collectivized. People had their work, homes, land, belongings, and livelihoods taken from them. In collective canteens, food, distributed by the spoonful according to merit, became a weapon used to force people to follow the party's every dictate.
Nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek fled to the island of Taiwan, formerly known as Formosa, and was followed by as many of his supporters as could escape. Dissidents were arrested or shot. And in 1953, so-called Chairman Mao, now head of the Communist Party and the Communist State, officially instituted his first so-called 5-year plan, a series of edicts that eliminated privately owned businesses and instituted collectivization of Chinese agriculture. Writes Lauren Ream, quote, by 1956, 67.5% of all modern industrial enterprises were state-owned, and 32.5% were under joint public-private partnership. No privately owned firms remained. And the situation was similar for agriculture. By 1957, about 93.5% of all farm households were under state control, with former so-called wealthy owners killed or arrested and moved to other types of labor, while, similar to the moves made by Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, the Chinese government placed people who had no agricultural skills or knowledge in charge of the farms. The results were inevitable and mirrored the Ukrainian Kulak tragedy. Years of starvation and death, now known as the Great Famine. Of this 1958-1959 to 1961 nightmare, The Guardian's Tanya Brinigan wrote in 2013, quote, in an unremarkable city in central Henan province, more than 1 million people, 1 in 8, are wiped out by starvation and brutality over 3 short years. In one area, officials commandeer more grain than the farmers have actually grown. In barely 9 months, more than 12,000 people, a third of the inhabitants, die in a single commune. 1/10 of its households are wiped out. 13 children beg officials for food and are dragged deep into the mountains where they die from exposure and starvation. A teenage orphan kills and eats her 4-year-old brother. 44 of a village's 45 inhabitants die. The last remaining resident, a woman in her 60s, goes insane. Others are tortured, beaten, or buried alive for declaring realistic harvests. refusing to hand over what little food they have, stealing scraps, or simply angering officials. The darkness, the abyss of collectivism. Continuing, when the head of a production brigade dares to state the obvious, that there's no food, a leader warns him, that's right deviationist thinking. You're viewing the problem in an overly simplistic manner. And when those horror stories are aggregated, as Brannigan notes, in his acclaimed book, Mao's Great Famine, Frank DeCotter estimates that the death toll reached at least 45 million. This first phase of the Maoist terror regime continued with his so-called Great Leap Forward, also known as the Second Five-Year Plan, begun in 1958. Mao slightly pulled back central collectivist control of agriculture in 1960, but reversed course in 1962. And by 1966, he ramped up the centralization and terror with what was called the Cultural Revolution, known in full as the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Oh, man. As History.com observes, quote, in August 1966, at a meeting of the plenum of the Central Committee, he, Mao, shut down the nation's schools, calling for a massive youth mobilization to take current party leaders to task for their embrace of bourgeois values and lack of revolutionary spirit. In the months that followed, the movement escalated quickly as the students formed paramilitary groups called the Red Guards and attacked and harassed members of China's elderly and intellectual population. The population was urged to rid itself of the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas. All told, analysts working on the Black Book of Communism estimate that from 1949 to 1999, the number of casualties wiped out by Marxist Chinese collectivism is approximately 60 million. Oh, and that title, Great Leap Forward, that also was adopted by Mao's protege, Pol Pot, the Marxist tyrant of Cambodia and head of the Communist Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which from 1975 to 1979 wiped out private property and business, purged religion, and exterminated the so-called educated. As the BBC notes, quote, declaring that the nation would start again at year zero, Pol Pot isolated his people from the rest of the world and set about emptying the cities, abolishing money, private property, and religion, and setting up rural collectives. Anyone thought to be an intellectual of any sort was killed. Often, people were condemned for wearing glasses or knowing a foreign language. Ethnic Vietnamese and Cham Muslims in Cambodia were also targeted. All told, best estimates of the death toll from Cambodian communism rise to 2 million people. These were great leaps forward in slaughter and oppression, especially in attacks on the belief in God. In fact, one of the key themes for all of the major collectivist murder nations is the government attack on the free practice of religion, be it the crushing of Polish Christians, the suppression of the Russian Orthodox Church, by the way, one of the purest forms of Christianity going back to the days of the apostles, or numerous kinds of religious practice being crushed in China, Cambodia, Vietnam, and other socialist states.
July 22, 2020. A loud knock on the door at the home of a woman in China's Xiamen City. She tells the police outside they cannot enter her home without a permit. Moments later, they destroy the lock and enter anyway, breaking up what the government says is an illegal meeting. 4 days later, Sunday, July 26th, government workers removed the cross from the roof of Small River Christian Church in Xinfin County, Jiangxi Province. These are just two recent examples, both incidents occurring just days ago in the Chinese Communist Party's crackdown on Christians and their churches.
The collectivists see it as imperative that they stamp out religion, particularly Christianity, because it reveals that there's a higher moral order, a natural law, and that the state is not man's master. As a perfect example of this, I'd like to return to our conversation with broadcaster David Knight, whose family adopted a child from China and who saw the stark difference between Chinese authoritarianism and liberty as they traveled by train from China to relatively free Hong Kong.
I could tell when we got into Hong Kong. You know how I could tell? We started seeing crosses. And for the first time, I just realized, for the last 2 weeks, we haven't seen any churches or any crosses. I mean, there's a very big church, but it's underground in China. A very big church. Probably a lot more Christians in China than there are in America. And they're probably a lot more hardcore because they're serious about it. They're not playing church. They're not just going there for, it's not a country club situation because there's real stakes involved there.
And the cultural religious repression marches hand in hand with the economic depression for all but the collectivist controllers. Take North Korea, for example. Since the Soviet-backed establishment of the North Korean collectivist regime in 1945, more than 3.5 million people have been wiped out through murder and forced starvation.
Back in 2006, we interviewed a North Korean defector who had spent time in one of the notorious North Korean prisons, and he described it as just an absolutely heinous and insidious place to be. And so the thought of my sister going there was just unimaginable. And I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified.
Death camps, surveillance, torture, arbitrary arrest, and central control of economic activity rule. And the results are visible. Despite the long line of authoritarians who've tried to hide the results, as National Geographic notes, nighttime satellite photos of North and South Korea show the stark difference between a collectivist, for the people, centrally planned economy in the North and a much freer economy in the South. South Korea is lit like a Christmas tree, while the North is dark, energy deficient, and nearly black. Ben Powell offers an economist's view to all of us at College Unbound.
When it comes to comparing the difference between socialist and capitalist economic systems, there's probably no better natural experiment in the world than the Korean Peninsula. You have a place with, essentially one geography, one history, one culture, one language, and a place that was pre-industrial in both the North and the South at the end of the Korean War, where one of them eventually adopts a capitalist economic system and the other a socialist economic system. And we see a massive divergence in living standards there, where in South Korea today, you have per capita incomes over $40,000, long life expectancy, great literacy. In North Korea, you have starvation. Income statistics in socialist countries are basically made up, but ballpark somewhere under $2,000 per capita, and a place that when Soviet aid went away in the 90s, thousands upon thousands of people died of starvation.
Again, as we stress, the collectivist attack on liberty cannot be decoupled from the disastrous effects of a lack of liberty that are visited on economic well-being.
This model farm looks more like a ghost farm. According to the manager, 850 farmers work here. We do not see a single one. This dilapidated greenhouse is the regime's attempt to convince us of how modern its agricultural system is.
As Professor Powell adds,
it's an economy that can't feed itself. It illustrates all of the problems with the centrally planned economy in terms of mobilizing information, in terms of incentivizing production, and in terms of just caring about the people. It is real socialism, as in state ownership and control over the main factors of production.
And of course, refugees have fled in their millions year after year from North Korea, from Vietnam, where according to R.J. Rummel, the death toll from collectivism lies roughly at 3.6 million, to Cuba, where upon the Soviet-backed communist Castro regime taking power, they seem to have lodged themselves in the 1950s. That's Cuba, once a vacation paradise, a place where communist control has decimated the economy and living standards of the residents, and seen upwards of 1.3 million people flee to the U.S. as of 2018. A place where NBC's incredibly reliable Brian Williams in 2016 claimed that many residents transport themselves and parcels on donkey carts because they like to.
It's still one of those nations where you see donkey carts alongside cars, trucks, and buses in downtown Havana because that's exactly what they'd rather have for transportation.
And then there's Venezuela, which saw Hugo Chavez nationalize industry after industry after industry, including the nation's biggest oil drilling and exportation. As Professor Powell observes, Hugo Chavez was not installed as a communist dictator via bullets. He was elected via the ballot box, perfectly embodying the Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez form of so-called democratic socialism.
The world does have an example of something that starts out as democratic socialism. When Chavez came to power in 1998 in Venezuela, promising to implement his own unique version of socialism, he was democratically elected. International observers, including former U.S. President Jimmy Carter, said that the elections were fair and democratic, as these things go. He was then reelected and put in a new constitution. He implemented his socialist policies.
Powell reminds observers that this Venezuelan collectivism brought on the typical downward spiral, even as the Venezuelan central bank kept printing money to hand out to favored political friends.
At first, the world thought Venezuela was doing okay, but really the economy was collapsing and they were living off their earnings from high oil reserves. But eventually, oil prices went down and so did production because the state owned, remember, government ownership of the major factors of production. The state-owned and operated oil company couldn't even keep quantity up despite having the world's largest reserves. And when things went bad, as they inevitably do if you have a planned, centralized socialist economy, people would usually vote the bums out of office. But Maduro has been reelected with laughingly high margins because people are not free to vote against him. People who work for state firms are ordered to vote for Maduro or they'll lose their jobs. They put out food aid stations next to polling places so that if you vote correctly, you get awarded with food.
Que yo tengo tiempo y paso por un supermercado, yo me meto a ver qué producto consigo, porque a veces uno consigue algún producto exquisito, como por ejemplo un cornflake, o a veces no consigo nada.
The National Assembly, as it's constitutionally allowed to do, voted for a new interim president about a year and a half ago. He's not been able to take power because the military keeps Maduro in charge. What started out as democratic socialism became near socialism.
Malnutrition, starvation, unemployment, and despair. Is it any wonder that by November 2018, nearly 2.3 million, or 1 in 12 Venezuelans, were reported to have fled the collectivist nightmare? There are so many more tales of woe and terror, of lives lost and dreams destroyed. And lest we neglect the insight, we must remember that the socialist collectivist problem can come not only via bullets and bombs, but by the ballot box, and to different degrees. Even the former British colonized nation of India saw its first leader after English rule, Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, institute socialist collectivist policies from 1947, his first year in office, until his death in 1964, bringing the near-industrial Indian population the dark gift of economic disaster. Writes Arvind Virmani for the Times of India. So how did the socialist approach fare? In 1950, the welfare of the average Indian was 29% of that of the average world citizen. By 1979, it had reduced to 20%, or 1/5 of that of the average world citizen. By studying relatively hidden information like all of this, by being skeptical of the malignant pop media who so often have covered up or excused the truth, even as they derided those trying to reveal the moral and economic horrors of collectivism, which are truly connected, the economic and the terror. We've got to reiterate that. All of us can learn a great deal about Marxism, collectivism in practice. And we can see that its negative effects are both shocking in the form of torture, terror, or starvation, and of course the tears and tragedies that so many people experienced, but its effects are also subtle, such as the negative effects of Western central command and control from endless government bureaus, licensing, regulations, centralized government education, and favoritism that warps what should be the proper flow of true economic choices. We all suffer at the hands of authoritarian collectivists who would decide for us and our neighbors how to peacefully live our lives, and it's up to us to use what freedom we have left to teach people about the tragic history of these collectivist minds. It's up to us to change minds here before it's too late. For better days, for better chances, for better lives, thank you all for being part of the MRC CollegeUnbound team. Please spread the word to fellow freedom seekers, friends, family members, and neighbors who might want to explore these lessons as part of a homeschool regime. It's all free. You can watch the videos, pause the videos, go back, take notes, talk to friends, and soon we'll offer our final lesson on the topic, looking at the history of America and realizing that when commentators claim real socialism has never been tried here in America, they're monumentally wrong. Look forward to it. And by the way, if you want the text for this episode, which actually is expanded beyond our video, just click the Share This Episode tab on the main CollegeUnbound page, and it's all yours. Just like all the other videos, you can do the same with all of those. The text is right in there under Share This Episode. And please tell your friends there's something wonderful coming in the next lesson. And hopefully we've provided some good material in all the lessons so far. For MRC, I'm Gardner Goldsmith. Be seeing you. I hope you like what we're creating. This new endeavor is designed for you, and I hope you'll link through to the official site and sign on. You'll get special access to all the new videos, you'll get the fun quizzes you can take anytime, and you'll get special ideas to share with friends at this crucial time to gain in wisdom. It's all free. I hope you'll get in there and enjoy it.